Have you heard the news? The North American Debate Circuit is hosting monthly online tournaments with the chance to win cash. Join us this February 11th, with entry fees set at an affordable rate to spread debate. Hey, that rhymed.
Arthi and I negate our sole contention is upsetting the balance. Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man a fish, you feed him for a lifetime. In the case of West Asia, American involvement has coddled the region's government, rendering peace unsustainable and conflict abound. Without America's meddling, nations have taken matters into their own hands. Countries have turned to the pen rather than the sword. For example, just 3 days ago, Al Jazeera 23 finds that the prospects of a renewed truce in Yemen have grown as regional diplomatic activity to end the country's 8-year conflict intensifies, pushing for broader negotiations. Overall, Davos 22 finds with America in the backseat, every nation in the region is committed to de-escalation. Affirming and increasing U.S. involvement in the region upsets this delicate balance of peace in 2 ways. First is stirring the waters. Diplomatic re-engagement raises the ire of Iran. Tujmaj 21 argues America's foreign policy failures have left a bitter taste in the mouths of Iran's ruling leaders, and in response to America's policies, Iran has historically heightened repression and acute aggression. He concludes, regardless of the U.S.'s intent, American leaders will struggle in vain to change Iran's mind. As a result, affirming would invite Iranian retaliation, as Bianco 22 writes, although West Asian states have engaged in new dialogue, U.S. policy could prompt them to pivot back towards confrontation. This could reignite conflict in Yemen and Iraq as Iran fans the flames of war in the region. Bianco highlights bilateral talks with Iran have produced a months-long truce in Yemen, and if this dialogue continues, Iran and Saudi Arabia could agree on a permanent solution to Yemen. However, a renewed U.S. security push would break down these efforts. History is on our side. Abo 21 writes, following Biden's announcement to push for diplomacy in Yemen, the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels stepped up their military offensive, dramatically increasing airstrikes across the country, a deliberate act of Iranian retaliation. Abo concludes, failing to recognize that America's footprint causes escalation will prolong regional instability. And further prolonging the conflict is the last thing the region needs. Already, UNICEF reports that Yemen remains one of the largest humanitarian crises, with 17.8 million people, including 9.2 million children, lacking access to safe water, sanitation, and hygiene services. Quasm 22 furthers that the war in Yemen has killed 377,000 people, affirming only takes the lives of more innocent people. The second way affirming upsets the balance is through emboldening autocrats. America's policy in West Asia has notoriously banked on autocratic alliances, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, just to name a few. When America tries to help these dictators solve conflicts that they are complicit in, the opposite ends up happening. Adderb 22 writes, U.S. West Asian diplomacy has historically forced it to overlook human rights abuses by partner nations, in effect appeasing the autocrats that perpetuate the region's underlying wars. Even worse, America couples diplomacy with unconditional military aid. IISS 22 explains, in West Asia, countries will only consider U.S. diplomacy if it also entails military support, arms sales, and military aid. This emboldens autocratic governments to act hastily. Huffman 22 writes, America's autocratic partners fuel ongoing conflicts. Whether it's intervening directly or supplying arms to rebel groups, these bad apples are confident that they'll remain shielded by the U.S. from the consequences of their reckless behavior. Instead of stabilizing the region, America's policies have done the exact opposite. Adher puts it simply, the U.S. has willfully ignored its responsibilities to defend democracy in West Asia. Turning away from the dictators in the West is how the wars there will be resolved and the region finally stabilized. Overall, perpetuating authoritarianism in the region is horrible, as Diamond 19 warns the main threats to security all stem from authoritarianism. Globally, Farker 17 quantifies oppressive regimes has killed more than 100 million people. In order to prevent American diplomacy from upsetting the balance we currently see in West Asia, Ravenclaw RK is proud to negate.
Okay. Time will start now. We affirm the United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. Contention 1 is Track 1 and Track 2 diplomacy. U.S. diplomacy is shifting away from Track 1 dialogue and towards Track 2, increasing effectiveness and revolutionizing the way we create peace. O'Byrne 18 writes that current political realities within the U.S. have created a shift in diplomatic strategy to Track 2 diplomacy, which can strengthen communication on bilateral relationships, climate action, and economic development, avoiding the lack of continuity and understanding between traditional Track 1 participants. Track 2 diplomacy is simply a reorganized and more effective version of our past action. O'Byrne continues that Track 1 diplomacy is corrupted by power, which suppresses underlying issues of weaker parties. Track 1 diplomacy is normally closed down at the peak of conflict when it's needed most. Track 2 diplomacy calls for informal interactions between members to develop strategies that influence public opinion and organize resources to resolve conflict. As a result, Track 2 empowers disenfranchised groups by giving them a platform from which they can air their views is effective both at pre-violent conflict and post-violent conflict stages and involves grassroots and middle leadership. Increasing our usage of Track 2 will successfully increase the success rates of diplomatic initiatives. Interacting tracks make Track 1 more effective by about 20 percentage points and higher than official interventions by 252%. In West Asia, this materializes in Yemen. Al-Hajj 22 finds that a fresh round of violence in Yemen comes following failure to extend a ceasefire between the warring sides. When the U.S. increases its diplomacy in the region, K21 finds that its diplomacy tends to be backed by aid. Morgenstern 22 continues that foreign aid is a tool that can be used to solve specific problems and project U.S. values. Biden has switched his foreign policy from military aid to economic assistance, as Catullus 22 writes that Biden announced $165 million in additional humanitarian aid to Yemen. On top of this, increased truces would also increase aid flows, as Post 22 writes that ceasefires in the past have reduced casualties by 60%, and a longer extension of the truce would be creating the stability needed to carry out longer-term assistance. Without aid, millions starve, as Europe 22 finds that 17 million will be facing acute food insecurity. Conundrum 2 is critical climate. A major part of U.S. diplomatic efforts in West Asia goes through green investments. Schwarzstein 20 writes that resource scarcity accelerated by climate change is worsening, and as the U.S. helps confront internal stability, it must also begin to reckon with environmental emergencies. Climate change in the Middle East will manifest crises all over the world. Diplomacy is the first key step, as Progress 21 writes that climate change represents an opportunity for the U.S. to put diplomacy first in the Middle East. America and its regional partners possess the technical know-how to help with climate change challenge, and the U.S. can serve as a key broker between these countries. West Asia plays important roles in the efforts to implement a global energy transition and combat climate change. Saudi Arabia, for instance, not only remains the world's leading oil producer, but also is deeply involved in international climate negotiations. Unfortunately, Taylor 19 writes that air pollution will kill an estimated 150 million more people worldwide for every single degree Celsius of warming. Conundrum 3 is Turkey. Currently, Erdogan is escalating tensions with Syria. Turkish threats to launch ground operations into Syria against the PKK have again raised tensions. Without U.S. action, invasion happens in the spring. Jeffrey elaborates that PKK attacks against Turkish civilian targets have led Erdogan to threaten ground operations. Erdogan might be seeking to intimidate the PKK from launching attacks right before the June elections. Unfortunately, Turkey-U.S. coordination on Syria is not as high level as in the past. However, diplomatic action now uniquely solves. Jeffrey from December 9th writes that U.S. officials could build on past three-way Turkey-U.S. SDF arrangements. In 2016, the U.S. committed to Turkey to ensure an SDF withdrawal, and in 2019, Ankara, Washington, and the SDF formally agreed to a withdrawal of SDF forces. Given the importance for both the U.S. and the SDF of forestalling and destabilizing Turkish incursion, Washington should revitalize these commitments, and the SDF could withdraw and extend its pledge not to attack Turkey in return for a Turkish promise not to move against Manjib or the northeast. The impact is Iran. Iran has plans to respond militarily to Turkish incursion in Syria. Azizi 22 writes that if Turkey decides to carry out its plan to attack northern Syria, Iran will respond via proxy forces. The situation could spiral out of control and lead to a broader and longer-term conflict. Thus, Glen is proud to affirm.
Yep, okay, time can start now. Since you just spoke, can I have the first question?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. When was the concept of Track 2 diplomacy introduced?
So Track 2 diplomacy has been a thing for a long time, but right now, because of the current political climate, we're seeing a shift toward Track 2 diplomacy.
Okay, but just as a follow-up to that, can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Okay, so it's been a concept for a long time. Why hasn't it been yet adopted by the U.S. federal government as their official diplomacy strategy?
Because right now, tensions are specifically high in the Middle East. So right now is a time where the U.S. is starting to shift toward that type of diplomacy because they've seen that other forms of diplomacy are not working and they're not being as effective. Can I take a question?
Yeah, okay, we'll get on that later. Yeah.
Okay, so on your conundrum 2 on emboldening autocrats, right? So if we don't have the U.S. as a policeman there to take accountability for the autocrats' actions, then who will stop these autocrats?
We say that the U.S. themselves are the ones that are emboldening the autocrats. They themselves are supporting Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, just to name a few. They're not stopping it. They're actually encouraging it. We see them in these countries. They're just literally selling arms to these autocratic governments. And as you can tell, the impacts are quite disastrous. Can I ask a question?
Okay. We'll contest that. Yeah. Sure.
All right. So let's go to your climate change contention. Do you know what happened a week ago in the Middle East regarding climate change?
You're going to have to be more specific than that.
Do you know what happened last week in the Middle East regarding climate change?
You can tell me.
Okay, West Asia as a whole, like the Middle East as a whole, they went together and then they started talking about climate solutions. How do we make a greener planet? Doesn't that show like why do we need more like U.S. diplomacy if they're doing it on their own regionally?
So what we're saying is that these regional talks are not as effective as you say they are. We have like cards that prove this. And then we're saying that whenever with the US coming in, the US has like key leverage. And whenever the US is engaging in diplomacy in West Asia, a lot of this diplomacy is done through green investment. And as a result, by resolving like these internal armed conflict, they also have to address these climate challenges in West Asia, which is why the US is key as an actor to solve climate change.
Yeah, you can take a question.
Sure. Okay, so if on your Iran, on your Sharing the Waters, if the hardliners aren't in power, then how do they have any influence over like if Iran's gonna attack?
Can you clarify your question?
So you talk about Iranian hardliners, correct?
Yeah, we talk about Iran's like main leaders.
Right. So if these hardliners are not in power right now, the status quo, then why would Iran like retaliate, right? Because these hardliners don't want to become more unfavorable, right? Because they're already so unfavorable. So this would not work if like Iran retaliated.
Okay, it's the fact that Iran as a whole does not like the US. It's not just the hardliners, it's like the Houthi rebels and like there's a lot other actors, but Iran as a whole, they just don't like the US.
Is everyone ready? Awesome. Time can start. Now, let's go through the many problems in their case, starting on their first contention of Track 1 and Track 2 diplomacy. The main card that they use is Oburn 18, but it's sent in the email chain. You can look at it. They use Oburn to say the U.S. will do Track 2, but two problems. Firstly, it doesn't even say the U.S. will shift to Track 2. They just bracket it in, which means they have literally misconstrued their evidence, indicted. But secondly, this evidence is from 2018, meaning the shift into Track 2 has been so-called taking place for 5 years, yet we haven't seen any of the positive changes my opponents mentioned. We also haven't seen the U.S. federal government specifically adopt it. But secondly, this argument has absolutely nothing to do with the resolution, which reads, the United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. In this case, the actor identified in the resolution is the United States federal government. However, Track 2 diplomacy is technically defined by Stats 19 as being a meeting of unofficial representatives on both sides with no government participation. As long as the U.S. government is the one in the resolution, it's not going to be Track 2. Then they talk about Track 2 working in Yemen. None of their evidence says that. They also mention how Biden is switching from foreign aid or military aid to economic assistance, but their evidence just said the U.S. can maintain humanitarian assistance, not that it will. Instead, what we see right now that Biden is doing, he literally just passed a new plan to increase military aid with Saudi Arabia. Then they talk about aid working in Yemen, but realize the humanitarian assistance they talk about is not diplomacy. Meanwhile, the military aid we talk about is diplomacy. Think about it this way. No country is going to listen to the U.S. as a mediator unless the U.S. has leverage. And the way they get the leverage is by selling arms sales. Answer 22 confirms Biden will never stop arms sales. He released a new plan to sell even more. They're going to continue selling arms as a result of diplomacy. But secondly, on their next contention of climate diplomacy, this is a really bad argument. They say the U.S. has the technological know-how to help these actors, but having technology to solve climate change and diplomacy specifically to solve internal armed conflicts is not the same thing. Think about it logically. They just make a bunch of jumps from technology to diplomacy to climate change back to conflicts, but it's really like not logical at all. It's not even part of the topic. But also, their evidence comes from 2021. Look to just 6 days ago in 2023, where Kairos 20 finds that the Middle East and West Asia are hosting consecutive summits, offering the region a rare chance to find a collective voice on the climate issue. And even if in 2022, like my opponents mentioned in Cross, if the U.S. is the best option, then the U.S. is already solving. The White House 22 finds President Biden met with the leaders of the West Asian region, and the leaders reaffirmed their commitment to solving the climate crisis through diplomacy. Throwing more diplomacy at them is completely useless. It'll just waste our resources. Then they try to say that regional climate talks are less effective, and they send this Rosenberg 21 evidence. It does not mention the world's regional at all. It doesn't even talk about the same thing. It's talking about climate startups. That's not a country. That literally supports our side because their main point is how technology can help climate change. Major turn. But then more importantly, their main thesis they talk about in Cross-X is that like regional climate talks are better. But then like once again, their card has nothing to do with that. Finally, on their contention 3 of diplomacy, all this entire contention relies on the fact that diplomacy will actually work with Turkey. However, what we would argue is that diplomacy fails because of mistrust. Phyllis 22 finds that Turkey and the United States are in an atmosphere of mutual mistrust, and Carr is extremely angered about Iran's actions, which it considers to be demonstrably against Turkey's interests. If Washington goes in and does another action that is against Turkey's interests, Erdogan is obviously not going to like America, and it's not going to do diplomacy with them. They themselves say that the U.S.-Turkey cooperation is not high right now. This is because of mistrust. It's an underlying problem that they can't solve by throwing more diplomacy at Turkey. In order for effective diplomacy, we need credibility, and the U.S. does not trust the U.S. as a credible mediator. Even Erdogan has said that he does not like the U.S. mediation. For all of these reasons, it's a very clear Neg ballot.
I'm just going to go down our case defending and then go to theirs doing offense. All right. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so starting at the top of our case, right, track 1, track 2 diplomacy, they talk about our Oberon card, that it says that like the US will do like that it's like misconstrued evidence. But the thing is, what we're trying to explain to you is the fact that the track 1 and track 2 diplomacy, it literally states in the card that the US sees it as a viable resource and it will be used. And then the thing is, they say that it's like 5 years old. The thing is, we're explaining to you that when you affirm track 2 diplomacy gets implemented, that is our whole point. They obviously like did not understand this point of our contention. But then we would concede like the D-links on critical climate. So to move on to Turkey, we would say they only make one response to this, and this is the fact that like Turkey, like there's like mistrust between the US and Turkey when diplomacy occurs. The thing is, let's think about this logically, judges. There's NATO and the US, which is the US is part of, which is the biggest supporter of Turkey, and suddenly Turkey is just going to think that all of a sudden when like some diplomacy comes into the region, the US and NATO will turn their back completely on Turkey. Like that is never going to happen. We can't buy the fact that there's actually going to be mistrust between the US and Turkey, and we know that like they will come in afterwards. This is like completely illogical, like even thought, the fact that like NATO and US would like turn their backs on them, especially considering Turkey is like the US's biggest ally in the region. So now that like we have Turkey and we have track 1 diplomacy, let's move on to their contentions. Okay, so starting at the top, they talk about like this like interregional negotiation. So on their Velasco 6 times more likely to craft peace agreements card, the evidence isn't specific to West Asian regionalism. It just broadly refers to the regional organizations. On the contrary, Server in 2018 explains that almost all forms of regionalism in West Asia aimed at conflict resolution have failed for 2 reasons. A lack of democratic principles, and B, the non-existence of economic interdependence to unite countries. Second is regional cooperation is in vain, as Newsgram 6 days ago writes that Yemen warring parties are gearing up for new waves of conflict in 2023 amid lack of decisive steps towards sustainable peace. Web Relief last month continues that a renewed escalation in Syria will be the last straw for millions. Intensified military action has sparked fears of further conflict. Overall, Punia 22 concludes that the Middle East is growing nucleus of raging conflicts as perpetual antagonism between Israel, Arab states, and Iran builds. Now let's move on to their first link, which is about Iran. This argument is purely speculative. Even if Iran is angered by the Western presence in the region, there's no reason they lash out and start this huge regional conflict that they talk about over diplomacy. There's no contextualization as to why the U.S. is such an immense threat to Iran and starts conflict. Then American Progress 2020 finds that instability in the Middle East has created incentives for de-escalating tensions. The United States should support Gulf partners to de-escalate tensions with Iran and should work with its allies. There's 2 reasons why Iran can't lash out. First is domestic protest means it's focused internally right now. And then second is a collapsing economy makes it difficult to sacrifice resources on a new military excursion. These are all completely speculative, and they don't actually look at like Iran's like country and like the economy and what's actually going internally. Their evidence is talking about a truce from July, but Al Jazeera reports in October that the Yemen truce recently ended and the conflict is restarted, meaning the status quo diplomacy does not work right now. Their truce is not talking about right now. Now on authoritarianism, let's turn this because the U.S. increases diplomacy. The U.S. is currently trying to spread democracy in the Middle East and combat human rights violations. Thailand 21 finds that Biden's plans to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East are well underway. The U.S. has begun to encourage democratic reform in the Middle East. Then turn again. The U.S. is good. 2 warrants, diplomacy, World War 13 argues that the U.S. system of security commitments ensures institutional relationships that foster political communication. Second is lashing out. Brandt's 15 finds that U.S. reentrenchment would force local powers to spend more on defense, and this is exactly why we would affirm.
Okay, can I get the first question?
Sure.
Time can start now. So let's talk about democracy. Can you name a single example of a country in West Asia that the U.S. has actually turned to democratic?
Like, okay, wait, why are we talking about democracy? Can you just give me some context? I'm just curious.
I mean, it was your response that like the U.S. is supporting democracy in West Asia.
Well, we're like we're trying to say that like the autocratic, it's just like their diplomacy is acting like it's not like instilling democracy, but it's using the U.S. democracy as like essentially like a police force in like the region. And like, are you talking about our responses to like autocratic governments?
Yeah. So
okay, so we just say that like they're trying to like combat, they're like not like spreading their democracy to instill it into governments. What we're trying to say is they're acting like a police force for the Middle East by like trying to combat these human rights violations.
So going with that narrative, if they're acting like the police, then why are human rights abuses still increasing in authoritarian countries after the U.S.?
Are crimes still committed in a town that has a police force? Yes, it's because something slipped through. But if you see in the past, since the Middle East has been like re-entered, we could see like a mass decrease in these humanitarian crimes.
Which crimes has the U.S. specifically committed? Also, I'm pretty sure human rights violations are increasing, but which crimes has the U.S. specifically like taken down or held accountability for?
Like human crimes, like ethnic cleansing, genocides, like
where? Like where?
In these conflict zones that we're talking about, like Yemen, Syria, just across the Middle East.
Well, in Yemen, like the U.S. is literally giving like military aid to Saudi Arabia so that they can bomb Yemeni civilians. So isn't that like a human rights abuse that the U.S. did not catch? That's like on a much larger scale.
We would say that they're trying to be as responsible with Saudi Arabia as possible, and we would say that they're holding off the Houthi rebels and which are backed. Yeah, that's what's happening in Yemen. They're holding back the Houthi rebels, so they need to have some sort of like military action so that they don't take over, because it'd be much worse. Can I have a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. So you guys talk about like in general, you guys are like talking about this like upsetting like the balance, right? Can you explain your like autocrats, I guess?
Oh yeah, sure. So basically what we're saying is that how the US does diplomacy in the first place, looking at like the big actors in the region like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, how it does diplomacy with those countries, which are the countries that are involved in most of the conflicts, is by giving them military aid. Think about it this way. Like the US has to get these countries—
Isn't it going to be given to them by like any regional actor?
No,
like China, Russia?
Okay, you could have made that argument if you wanted to, but the argument you did make is like the U.S. is a democracy. But anyways—
No, this is a question.
I'll like
it's not an
right?
argument. It's just a question.
I mean—
wouldn't it just be given by any other regional actor?
Like, China and Russia right now are not funding millions of dollars of arms sales to—
Yes, they are. Russia is literally in the Yemeni civil war right now, and they're funding arms.
Who are they funding it to?
They're funding it to the Houthi rebels.
Okay, well, the U.S. is funding it to Saudi Arabia, which is—
Yeah, exactly, and then China would just step in. It's like, okay,
what?
That's cross, but—
Okay, can I see that evidence?
It will be like our case, weighing, and then their case. So if everyone's ready, time will begin on my first word. On our case, overall, our argument is super simple, that we tell you that amid U.S. pullout from the region, West Asian states were forced to create dialogues amongst themselves, which is currently solving conflicts everywhere. They say that they really don't, like we say that literally 3 days ago, renewed truce in Yemen has grown as regional diplomatic activity improves. When the U.S. pulls out, regional powers talk towards regional solutions, which are more permanent. They like have a few responses. They talk about a Velasco card, but we never even read this card at all. Then they talk about Newsgram, We Believe, Punya, evidence. All this is from a few weeks ago. Meanwhile, our evidence post states from 3 days ago, actors are working towards a permanent solution. The most important argument on our side is our second point on emboldening autocrats. On our second contention, it's really clear increasing U.S. engagement comes to the side of authoritarian support. American diplomacy includes military support, which emboldens dictators. They try to turn this by saying that U.S. increases democracy. Once again, no example of a single country. They talk about how the U.S. helps reduce genocides and saving lives by being a police force, but once again, they can't quantify. Well, we can. The U.S. supports Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, just to name a few, and they support a lot more, and they sell arms to them. They will try to say that Russia and China are worse. Their own evidence says that declining confidence, capacity, and the will of the democratic world is especially the United States. They try to make the text super small, but when we increase it, that's what it sells. That's what it says. Now now prefer us on the comparative weighing. Realize that they're creating the problems that they're trying to solve. So all of their impacts on like wars and everything, genocide, you can cross apply to our side. The autocratic governments the U.S. is funding, 100 million people die from that. This far outweighs the few million they save. Now go to their case. On their first contention on track 1 and track 2 diplomacy, their main card is over in 18. But once again, 2 problems with that. It doesn't even say the U.S. will shift. They bracket it in, meaning that they literally misconstrued their evidence, indict it. Second, they say that the U.S. is seen as a valuable resource. Seeing something as a valuable resource is not the same thing as adopting it, but also the entire contention relies on the fact that track 2 will be adopted, but it has nothing to do with the resolution where the actor identified is the United States federal government. Track 2 diplomacy is defined with no government participation. As long as the U.S. government is not acting, it never is, and it never will be track 2. Now moving on to their second contention of climate diplomacy, they literally concede our responses. But look to just 6 days ago, in 2023, Carros 23 finds the Middle East is hosting consecutive COP summits, offering the region a rare chance to find a collective voice on the climate issue. And even in 2022, if they try to say that the U.S. is the best option, the U.S. is already solving, as President Biden met with the GCC and addressed the climate crisis through other stuff. But also solvency exists right now. CNN 22 finds that the states are embarking on their own clean energy projects, investing billions in the renewable energy sector. And yeah, this means that regional countries solve for climate change so we get access to their millions of lives impacts. They'll try to say that regional climate talks are less effective, but look at the Rosenberg 21 evidence. It literally does not mention the word regional at once. It actually says word for word, climate tech companies are small and don't seem to be growing. That literally supports our side because their main point is how technology can help climate. Major turn on their case. On their C3 diplomacy, once again, they say that the Turkey likes the U.S. by Erdogan. Turkey's president has said that he criticizes U.S. mediation efforts, and that is why diplomacy with Turkey will never work. They themselves say that the U.S.-Turkey cooperation is not high right now. For all these reasons, we strongly negate.
I'm going to be going on our case, their case, and then some weighing. Right. Time starts. Let me just get my timer ready. Time starts now. Judge, the cleanest place to vote in this debate is our contention 3 on Turkey. We tell you that Erdogan is currently escalating tensions with Syria as threats have surfaced against the PKK in Syria. And absent U.S. action, Erdogan would invade Syria since the PKK threatens Turkey. Now they made one response to this. Let's respond. So the only thing they said is that Turkey criticizes the U.S. because of mistrust in the region. But we tell you that my partner said in rebuttal, NATO is the biggest supporter of Turkey, and there won't be mistrust between the U.S. and Turkey because Turkey is the U.S.'s biggest ally in the region. It's simple logic. We just tell you that Turkey is practically waiting for the U.S. to come in to broker a deal in order to stop the invasion. So we're clearly winning there. Let's start on our contention 1 on track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. We're dropping that. And then also on climate change, they made all these turns, but we also dropped that, and that's not a part of the debate anymore. So, Judge, you can't evaluate any of their responses on climate change. So now onto their side. First, on upsetting the balance, they didn't respond to any of the turns on my partner made in rebuttal. We tell you that all forms of regionalism have failed because of 1, lack of democratic principles, and 2, no economic cooperation. 0 responses on that. And next, on stirring the water, they never responded to Iran, that Iran would never lash out. My partner read 2 turns on this, and that diplomacy in Yemen isn't working in the status quo because the truce ended. And on what they collapsed on emboldening autocrats, we tell you that if we don't have the U.S. as a policeman to take accountability for these autocrats' actions, who will stop these autocrats from continuing to fuel these internal armed conflicts? No one. And also, they tell you that we don't quantify our impact, but we tell you that every single country they mentioned that the U.S. is in is our impact. We're saying that they're acting as police in every single one of those countries. And if the U.S. wasn't in the region, it would be much, much worse. So we need the U.S. there in order to stop. Okay, now let's weigh. Let's take a look at their impacts. Their impact on autocrats is not really clear. They just tell you that oppressive regimes have killed people and that there's human rights abuses, but they don't give any clear examples about how this actually materializes. Well, our impact is very clear. If the U.S. doesn't intervene, then Turkey will invade northern Syria, increasing conflict. This is why you're voting on us, because you're voting on history. In 2018, Turkey invaded northern Syria, and they will do it again if U.S. doesn't step in. This is why you have to. So this is why you have to affirm, right? And on probability, once again, Turkey already invaded Syria, but we don't know when their like impact is going to happen because it's not really clear. So without the US in the region, conflicts will be much, much worse, which is why you have to affirm judge.
Yeah, so we'll start time now. So if according to your own logic, Turkey is waiting for the US, then why is it building up to attack Syria?
Because they know that these negotiations are going to occur and they want like the US to help them solve this.
So
That's what we
Turkey's
tell you in
aggressing
case.
because they know they can't aggress? That doesn't make any sense.
Sorry?
So Turkey is aggressing because they know that the US will come in? How does that make sense?
That makes complete logic. If you know that the US is going to come in and aid you with negotiations and other like forms of figuring this out, they know that the only way to flag down the US's attention is by aggressing on like Syria, because they know that like the US has backed the Kurds.
So then the last time Turkey invaded, why didn't the US do anything?
Because they didn't have as big of a stake in the region and in the area with the Kurdish people, and that's exactly, this ties back to our autocratic point about how the US is acting like the police and trying to carry out like negotiations.
If Turkey really was like waiting for US mediation, wait, really quick, if Turkey was waiting for US mediation, why did they attack Syria in the first place?
Because have you never heard of like the giant conflict that's been going on between like the Kurds and like Turkey? That's been a giant issue that's been going on before, and now if we can increase the and the reason is because American diplomacy wasn't there before. If we increase this American diplomacy, then it's allowing them to stop this from happening again. You just gave us like past examples. Can we have a question?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, so you guys talk about like these autocratic governments, right? And then you say that we have no examples. But wouldn't you say that our examples are every single one you have, because we're talking about how they're policing these nations?
Okay, policing these nations, or you can take it.
Yeah, so I think that our argument, to just simplify our argument, it's that the United States is literally supporting these autocratic governments by selling guns, by selling military arms to them. They're literally giving military weapons to these dictators.
Also, if you
That's not policing.
Yeah. Also, if you want to use the police analogy, I don't think a credible police would be giving guns to criminals. If that makes sense.
No, the issue is the only way that they get on the good side of these autocratic governments to actually be able to influence them is by essentially giving them gifts like arms deals.
Have they
as well as the fact that
why is Saudi Arabia still an authoritarian country? Why is the UAE still authoritarian? Why is Bahrain still authoritarian?
Because
then that goes back to like, you don't want to spread American imperialism. If we made the argument that they're spreading imperialism, you guys would just say that's bad. Like, this is going on the fact that there's two bad sides in this world. We have two bad sides. We have this authoritarian regime, and then we have these bad rebels on like in every single conflict. And then so the US has to back the better of both, like there's like the better of the bad world.
Okay, how does imperialism
perfect every single time?
If you
like,
want
the world is not perfect. The US isn't perfect either. These countries aren't perfect either. Democracy isn't perfect.
If you want to do a two-world comparison, we have two worlds. One where the US isn't actively feeding military weapons into the hands of these countries that have literally killed millions of people, and one where the US is.
We would tell you that we literally have given you examples of the fact that it's going to happen anyways. Thank you.
So it'll be kind of like 3 reasons why Neg wins this round. Is everyone ready? Cool. Time can start now. It is game over when they have conceded that the US is creating the problems it's trying to solve. Again, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. The US is essentially giving these countries a fish for a day, but what they need is a solution that lasts for a lifetime. And we see this when the US steps back, these countries take matters into their own hands, which is why just 3 days ago, countries are moving towards a permanent solution in West Asia. All of their evidence about tensions increasing comes before this 3 days ago evidence. But then you need to ask yourself 3 questions when evaluating this round. The first is whether the US is supporting autocracies. The answer is yes. It's supporting Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, just to name a few. Use their own Robert 17 evidence, which states that there's a declining confidence in the democracy of the US. They keep talking about this police analogy, but let's think about it. As a credible police, you wouldn't be giving AK-47s and military guns to criminals that have already killed millions. You can use the same police analogy to vote Neg. We clearly extend that in order for US diplomacy to work, the US has to sell arms and guns to these dictators and criminals. Second question is whether track 2 diplomacy is governmental and being adopted. The answer to both of these is no. Their own O'Byrne evidence doesn't even say the US will shift. They just bracket it in. They've literally misconstrued their evidence. But then secondly, they say that the US sees track 2 as a viable resource. Seeing something as a viable resource is not the same thing as adopting it, but also track 2 diplomacy has nothing to do with government participation. If the actor in the resolution is the United States federal government, that they obviously can't participate in something without the government. It makes no sense. They don't respond to the fact that it's non-topical. Finally, you need to ask yourself where Erdogan likes diplomacy. The answer is no. Their entire contention on Turkey relies on Turkey getting to the negotiating table, but Turkey's president has literally said he doesn't like the U.S. mediation. How can you cooperate with a country that doesn't want to? It makes no sense. At the end of the day, you need to look at who's saving the most amount of lives. Our argument is simple. These same autocratic governments that the U.S. is literally backing and funding with all these military weapons have used these resources to kill over 100 million people. It would only extend like a few million of lives, but clearly 100 million is more than a few. It's a very clean neg ballot.
My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Judges, let's look at this round as a whole. It cannot just be summed up as a single quote about giving a man a fish. There are two main arguments on either side. On our side, we talk about how the Turkish leader Erdogan is currently escalating tensions with Syria as threats have surfaced against the PKK in Syria. Absent U.S. action, Erdogan would invade. Turkey just wants the U.S. to step in. We've given warrants and evidence. They only bring this up in the final Crossfire, and they only ask questions about this in the final Crossfire. They've conceded it thus far, thus you give us this argument. Then the main argument they're going for is backing autocratic governments. Remember our two responses. First is that the fact that the U.S. is acting like a police force to prevent these humanitarian casualties. The only reason they supply arms is because that's the only way that they can get in good with these big like autocratic countries. That's the only way they can essentially like bribe them to be able to like accept their policy. And second, these are going to happen anyways. Let's think about this logically. Any big arms dealer is going to jump at the opportunity to these civil wars. So the U.S. is the best of like a bad situation, you know, like they're going to police it in some way compared to like any other arms dealer, like Russia, China. You know, they would just let these human atrocities go on. So judges, let's look at this round. Let's think about this. Which is the most simple, clean way to vote? And it would most definitely be affirmative. We give you examples of Turkey happening. They've conceded it thus far into the round. The fact that like the Turkey narrative about Erdogan, like waiting for the U.S. to step in, and they only bring this up in Grand Crossfire. Don't let them do that. They can't just sum this round up as like give a man a fish to and it'll feed him, because the fact that it's much more complex than that, because these internal matters are going to be affected by some external like actor in some way, shape, or form. Thus, you're going to be voting affirmative because of the fact that Turkey is more probable. It has a bigger effect than because of the fact that theirs is going to happen in both worlds. It's non-unique. It's happening anyway. Thus, we're voting Aff.
Good debate, guys. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Good round. Thank you, judges.
Thank you, judges.